He found a Bigfoot cub lying on the bridge in the snow, but he didn't know who was standing in the fog behind the trees. What came out of the forest made him keep quiet for the rest of his life. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The storm had swallowed the mountain so completely that Thomas felt as if he were walking through the hollow interior of a cloud. Snow drifted in restless spirals, scratching at his face like shards of glass, and every breath burned as it left his lungs. For the past 2 days he had been moving without any true sense of direction, guided only by the dim memory of where the trail should have been, and by the stubborn instinct that if he kept going forward, something, anything, would eventually appear. His boots were soaked through despite the waterproof lining, and the cold had seeped so deeply into his legs that he sometimes wondered whether he still felt his own body or only the stiff weight of his clothes. Yet he walked, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender had been something he had promised himself he would never allow again. He had not planned to stay out this long. His annual winter hikes were usually strict, short, and mentally cleansing. 2 days alone in the mountains, a night under the stars, a handful of miles of solitude that helped him understand the things he avoided during the rest of the year. But the weather had turned faster than expected, blowing away the trail markers, the faint prints of his own boots, and any sense of familiarity in the terrain. Even the trees looked strange, their branches bent under the weight of the frozen air, their shapes twisted by the sharp contrasts of shadow and snow. Every direction seemed equally wrong, and every step carried him deeper into the unknown. He paused, leaning on a broken pine trunk, and looked around through the blinding white fog. There were moments, fleeting ones, in which the storm thinned just enough to give him a glimpse of the mountainside. Each time he hoped to see a landmark, a rock formation, a familiar ridge, the dark line of an old forest road. But the world offered him nothing except vague silhouettes of trees and a pale, shifting void that swallowed everything. He adjusted his backpack, wincing at the way the straps dug into his shoulders, and tried to push away the growing sense of dread. He had survived worse, at least that's what he told himself. He had known loneliness, grief, and the quiet ache of a life that had felt too small for too long. If emotional storms hadn't killed him, he reasoned, this one wouldn't either. But it was only half a comfort, because nature did not care for metaphors or resilience. Nature devoured whatever it wished, silently, indifferently, leaving nothing behind. Then he saw it. At first it was only a blur, something dark against the endless white, something too angular to be a rock and too still to be a tree. He narrowed his eyes, blinking against the icy wind, and took a cautious step toward it. The shape grew clearer. Low, slanted, with a broken roofline and thick beams darkened by moisture. It was a structure, a building, a cabin. Hope surged painfully fast, bright enough to make him dizzy. He moved quicker now, his feet slipping on patches of hidden ice as he forced himself forward. The wind lulled for a brief moment, and in that silence, he finally saw the full outline of the place. A small wooden hut, perched at the edge of a ravine, its windows frosted over, its roof heavy with snow. A narrow bridge, if one could call a single wide log a bridge, stretched between the ravine's edges, leading directly to the cabin's crooked front door. The bridge's surface was carved with uneven steps, as if someone long ago had tried to make crossing it less of a gamble. Relief swept through him like a wave of warmth. Shelter. A place with walls, a roof, and possibly even kindling. It meant survival, or at least a fighting chance. He stepped onto the bridge. His boot had barely touched the first icy indentation when he froze. There was something lying ahead. Something that almost blended into the snow. For a moment he thought it was a fallen backpack or some old fur rug left behind by a careless hunter. But the shape was wrong. too organic, too fragile in its posture. He took another step, squinting. It was a body. A small body, sprawled face down on the log, arms stretched limply forward as though it had been crawling before it collapsed. Snow had collected on its back in a thin, glittering layer. A few strands of long, matted hair clung to the wood. Thomas felt the world tilt. He stumbled forward, driven by instinct more than thought, his heart pounding in his ears. It wasn't a human child. He realized that before he even knelt beside it. The creature was covered in dense, shaggy hair, dark brown in some places, silvering at the tips where frost had settled. Its hands were large, disproportionate, with long fingers that ended in blunt, dark nails. Its feet, slightly visible beneath its curled legs, resembled something between a human child's and a young ape's. Too wide, too strong, built for climbing and gripping. Yet the size of the body, the shape of the shoulders, the slight taper of the waist, those were unmistakably juvenile. Whatever this creature was, it was young. He touched its shoulder gently. The fur was stiff with cold, but not frozen through. He pressed his fingers lower to where the ribs would be and felt the faintest tremor, a shallow, struggling breath. It was alive. For several seconds he simply knelt there, stunned, his mind swarming with memories of stories he had once dismissed as folklore. Whispered accounts of solitary giants in remote forests, tales of footprints too large to belong to any known animal, grainy photographs debated endlessly on internet forums, Bigfoot sightings, thousands of them across North America, always unproven, always doubted, myths carried by native tribes, sketches in dusty books, eyewitness claims mocked by anyone who trusted science. Yet here he was, kneeling by what could only be a young one. Fear shot through him, primal, instinctive. If this was a child, where were the adults? And what had happened to leave it alone like this? He looked around, half expecting a massive figure to emerge from the tree line. But the mountains remained silent. The only movement was the drifting snow. The only sound was the faint groan of the wind pushing against the cabin's roof. He had a choice to make, one that felt far heavier than any he had made in years. He could leave the creature, pretend he had never seen it, cross the bridge and hide in the cabin alone, survive, or he could help it. Thomas knew the kind of person he wanted to be. He also knew the kind he often failed to be. But when he looked down at the tiny, frost-coated form on the bridge, its shallow breaths growing weaker, he understood that walking away would be a wound he'd carry for the rest of his life. A deeper wound than any the mountain could inflict. He slid his arms beneath the creature, lifting it carefully. It was heavier than it looked, solid with muscle, but limp like a rag doll. A small whimper escaped its throat, a sound so soft and pained that it pierced straight through him. "Easy," he whispered instinctively. "I've got you." The bridge creaked under his weight as he crossed, clutching the cold, furry body against his chest. He kicked open the cabin door with his boot, sending a spray of frost into the dim interior. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Still, dead, untouched for months or even years. Dust lay thick on the broken furniture. The hearth was empty, except for a scattering of old ash, but the place had shelter, walls to keep the wind out, and enough broken wood that a fire was still possible. He set the creature down gently on his sleeping bag and knelt beside it to assess the damage. Its fur was matted with patches of dried blood, and there was a deep gash along its thigh, a clean, straight cut that could only have come from a blade or metal trap. Anger stirred inside him. Someone had hurt this child. Someone had chased it hard enough to drive it across a frozen ravine, bleeding and terrified. He cleaned the wound with melted snow, watching the creature flinch weakly. He murmured soft reassurances. He wasn't sure it understood. When he finished binding the leg with strips torn from his shirt, he lit a fire, coaxing the flames to life with shaking hands. The warmth spread slowly, touching first the air, then the walls, then the thin breath of the creature lying at his feet. When it opened its eyes, the world seemed to stop. The eyes were large, dark, and filled with a depth of awareness that startled him. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of something intelligent, frightened, and desperately trying to understand whether the world it had awakened to meant harm or safety. Thomas felt something shift inside him, something steady, grounding, and unexpectedly tender. "You're safe now," he whispered. The creature blinked slowly, then raised its hand, touching his wrist with surprising gentleness. A mimicry of human reassurance, a gesture learned from watching something else, perhaps a parent. In that moment, Thomas knew he would do whatever it took to keep it alive. The storm outside raged on, howling through the cracks of the cabin, but inside, a fragile silence settled. A silence not of emptiness, but of connection, thin as thread, delicate as frost, yet stronger than fear. And as night fell upon the mountains, Thomas watched over the creature, unaware that this moment, this choice, would bind his fate to a secret he would one day carry to his grave. The night inside the cabin stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the crackling of the small fire Thomas kept alive with constant, exhausted attention. Each time the flames dimmed, he jolted awake, half expecting to find the young creature beside him motionless again. Swallowed by the cold, it had barely escaped. But every time he leaned closer, he found its breaths, shallow, fragile, but present, lifting its small chest beneath the fur. Those breaths became an anchor for him, a quiet reminder that he was no longer alone in the storm, that something depended on him in a way no one had for years. By dawn, the fire had eaten through almost all the dry wood the cabin had left, and Thomas forced himself to rise. His body ached from the cold that crept into the room each time he drifted too far from the warmth. Yet when he looked down at the sleeping creature, curled weakly on his sleeping bag, the decision to go outside became easier. It needed him. That thought alone gave him a kind of strength he had long forgotten he possessed. He stepped outside as the storm finally loosened its grip, revealing a landscape sculpted by the night. Snow lay in thick, uneven layers across the ground, piling in drifts against the cabin walls. The air held a piercing stillness, one that felt less like peace and more like a long-held breath waiting to be released. Thomas trudged through the snow toward the nearest cluster of trees, searching for fallen branches he could use as fuel. The act was simple, but his mind raced with questions he was not ready to face. What had attacked the young creature? How long had it been running before collapsing on the bridge? And most importantly, would whoever had hurt it still be nearby? As he gathered wood, he spotted something half buried in the snow, an unfamiliar track that did not belong to any animal he recognized. It was deep, pressed hard into the earth beneath the snow, as if left by someone heavy, someone wearing boots. His breath caught. He followed the pattern with his eyes prints leading toward the ravine and disappearing into the dense whiteness. Hunters. The thought settled in him with cold certainty, the clean cut on the creature's thigh, the terror frozen in its posture, the way it had collapsed so close to shelter. It all pointed to the same truth. Someone had chased it. He lifted his head, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see movement. But the forest remained motionless, its silence as heavy as the snow on its branches. Still, the knowledge that others had been here, armed, determined, gnawed at him. If they came back, they would not stop until they found what they had wounded. He returned to the cabin with the wood pressed against his chest, his heart pounding faster than the effort should have required. When he opened the door, a soft sound greeted him, a faint, questioning whimper. The creature had lifted its head, blinking sleepily as its eyes searched for him. The moment it recognized him, it relaxed, lowering itself back onto the bedding. "I'm here," Thomas murmured, kneeling beside it. "I'm still here." He added the branches to the fire and watched as the flames regained strength, warming the small space. The creature shivered, shifting closer to the heat. Thomas reached out hesitantly, then rested his hand on the creature's back. Its fur was softer than he expected, warm now that the cold had begun to fade from its body. The creature did not pull away. Instead, it leaned ever so slightly into his touch. Something inside Thomas softened, a tight knot he had unknowingly carried loosening by degrees. He had been alone for so long that human connection had begun to feel like a memory, a fading echo he could touch only in dreams. But this fragile, wordless bond felt real. Throughout the day, the creature regained pockets of energy. It shifted, tried to sit up, and once, when Thomas wasn't looking, attempted to stand. The movement was clumsy, its injured leg trembling uncontrollably, and it nearly toppled into the wall. Thomas caught it just in time, steadying it with both arms. The creature made a small, frustrated sound, somewhere between a growl and a whine. "You'll walk again," he promised softly. "Just not yet. Not like this." When he let go, the creature reached out one long, furred hand and touched his chest, as if trying to understand the heartbeat beneath. The gesture was not random. It was purposeful, almost thoughtful. A sign of intelligence, a sign of trust. Hours passed this way, with the two sharing a space that began to feel less like a ruin and more like a sanctuary. Thomas spoke sometimes, not because the creature understood, but because the silence felt too thick otherwise. He told it about losing his parents young, about how he had never quite learned to build ties with people afterward. He confessed how he often wandered the world in hopes of finding a place that made sense. It was absurd, perhaps, to tell such things to a being that could not answer. But the creature listened, its expressive eyes following his movements, with a depth that made him feel as though, for the first time in years, someone truly heard him. Yet as the sun dipped behind the mountains, faint shadows of anxiety returned. The memory of the tracks he had found in the snow gnawed at him. The hunters could still be in the area, searching for signs of the creature they had injured. And if they found it, if they found him, they would not hesitate to kill them both. The thought filled him with a protective rage he had never experienced before. That night, as he tried to sleep beside the fire, Thomas found no rest. Every sound, every faint shift in the wind, sent a jolt of fear through him. At one point, he heard a crack from outside, a sharp, clean break of a branch that could not have been caused by snow alone. He sat upright, pulse racing, straining to hear more. But the world outside fell quiet again, as if mocking his alarm. He remained awake until dawn. The next morning brought a new kind of unease. As he stepped outside to gather more wood, he froze at the sight of fresh tracks leading past the cabin. Not the broad footprints of the creature's kind. No, these were human prints, made by someone who had circled the cabin's perimeter, perhaps more than once. Thomas's stomach twisted. They were close, and they were looking. He crouched down, examining the pattern. The depth of the prints suggested a heavy man. The spacing indicated long strides, cautious but deliberate. He imagined the hunter pausing, listening, peering through the frosted window. Had they seen him? Had they suspected what he was hiding? He returned inside quickly, bolting the door with a piece of wood he wedged beneath the handle. The creature noticed his tension immediately, tilting its head with a soft grunt. Thomas shook his head. "We're not safe," he whispered. "They're still out there." He spent the next hours reinforcing the cabin in the small ways he could, shoving furniture against the windows, gathering all the wood and scraps he could find to keep the fire going without leaving again. The creature watched him, alert and strangely calm, as though it sensed the danger but accepted it with a quiet understanding. By midday, a transformation had begun in Thomas. The fear that once dominated him had shifted into something sharper, more resolute. He realized he would not abandon the creature, even if it cost him everything. He had found it bleeding and helpless on the bridge, left to die by forces that saw it as nothing more than a prize. He would not let those forces reclaim it. The creature seemed stronger that afternoon. It rose again, this time managing a few shaky steps before collapsing against the wall. Thomas rushed over, steadying it. This time, instead of frustration, the creature looked up at him with something like pride. It let out a soft rumble, almost approving. The fleeting warmth of the moment was broken by a distant sound, a low, resonant cry that vibrated through the air in a way no human voice ever could. The creature froze, its ears twitched. Then, suddenly, it lifted its head and answered with a small, eager noise. Thomas's breath caught. That sound, the one that echoed across the mountainside, was not from a hunter. It was a call from something large, something strong, something searching. He rushed to the window, wiping the frost with his sleeve. At first he saw nothing but endless white. Then, through the thinning fog, he spotted it, a massive silhouette moving between the trees on the slope above the ravine. Then another, and a third. Their movements were deliberate, powerful, almost silent for beings of such size. They stopped often, listening, scanning the terrain. The creature beside him let out a soft, urgent sound, a plea, almost a greeting. Thomas stared in awe. It wasn't just one figure, it was a small group, a family. The adults had returned for their child. Fear and relief waged war inside him. Relief that the young one might finally be safe. Fear that the adults might not distinguish between a human protector and a human threat. He watched the figures move closer, pausing at the edge of the ravine, their dark shapes almost blending with the trees behind them. Then the largest figure raised its head and let out another deep, resonant call. The creature in the cabin responded instantly, pushing itself up despite the weakness in its leg. It tried to move toward the door, stumbling, and Thomas caught it again, helping it stay upright. The creature leaned into him, trembling not from pain, but from excitement, from recognition. This was its family. He opened the cabin door slowly, bracing for whatever reaction the adults might have. The cold slammed into them, but the creature ignored it, pulling forward with surprising strength. Together, they stepped onto the snow-covered ground, and Thomas felt the air thicken with silent expectation. The figures across the ravine grew clearer with every passing second. Their sheer size stunned him. They were taller than any man, their bodies covered in thick coats of dark fur that blended with the shadows of the forest. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dusky light, old, intelligent eyes that held the weight of centuries of survival. The smallest of the three stepped forward first, tilting its head as if studying the injured child. Then its gaze lifted to Thomas. He stood frozen, heart hammering, unsure whether to bow, look away, or simply pray. The largest figure approached next, slow and deliberate. With each step, the snow compressed under its weight with a deep crunch. It stopped a few paces away from Thomas and the young one. For a long moment, nothing happened. The adults did not roar or attack. Instead, they observed him with a kind of solemn curiosity. Thomas knelt and gently lowered the young creature onto its feet. The child let out a soft cry, wobbling toward the nearest adult. The larger creature bent down, scooping the small one into its arms with a tenderness Thomas had not expected. The child's small hands gripped its parent's fur as though afraid it might disappear again. The adult looked back at Thomas. Their eyes met. In that silent, breathtaking instant, an understanding passed between them, something ancient, something impossible to articulate. Gratitude, recognition, a warning, a promise. All at once. The adult gave a slow nod, barely perceptible, yet unmistakable. Thomas felt something in his chest break open, raw and overwhelming. He nodded back. Then, without a sound, the great beings turned and began to move away, carrying the young one with them. The fog wrapped around their silhouettes until they dissolved into the forest, leaving only their footprints in the snow and the echo of their presence lingering in the air. Thomas stood alone at the ravine's edge, the cold settling into his bones as the silence grew thicker. He returned to the cabin, not because he needed shelter anymore, but because he needed to collect himself, to understand what had just passed before him. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like a fading memory. He sat beside it, staring into the flames, knowing one thing with crushing clarity. He could never speak of this. Not to researchers, not to friends, not to anyone. Because if people knew, if hunters, scientists, governments learned what lived in these mountains, they would swarm the wilderness, tearing apart the quiet world that had sheltered those beings for centuries. They would capture, dissect, exploit. They would destroy. Thomas had seen the intelligence in their eyes. He had felt the warmth of the child's hand on his chest. He had witnessed a family risking everything to reclaim one of their own. He would not betray that. And so he stayed silent, watching the fire burn lower, letting the enormity of the truth settle into his bones. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life, a burden and a blessing intertwined, a secret that no one would ever hear. A secret he would, one day, take to his grave. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos we've already shared. There's plenty more waiting for you. And if this video moved you, share it with someone who would love it too.